The goat was thin. That was the first thing Idese noticed when her father led the man into the compound, and it was the only thing she could hold in her mind while the rest of her life came apart. A thin brown goat with a frayed rope around its neck, bleeding once, low, and tired, in the red dust of the yard. Behind it walked a stranger in a faded-off white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, worn sandals split at the toe, a cheap wristwatch loose on his arm. And her father, Nyameka, was smiling at this man as though the dead harvest had bloomed overnight. "This is him," her father said. "This is the man you will marry." The women at the well stopped drawing water. The men under the udara tree set down their palm wine. For a long moment the whole compound held its breath. Then it broke all at once. A clay pot dropped on stone, and the laughter scattered everywhere. "One goat," somebody said, loud enough to carry. "Nyameka has sold his daughter for one thin goat." Idese stood frozen in the doorway of her father's mud-brick house, the broom still in her hand, and she looked at the man who had been brought to take her away. He was not looking at the crowd. He was looking at the goat. And then he was looking at the cracked ground. And then, slowly, he lifted his eyes and looked at her. She had expected to find something ugly in his face, a drunkard's redness, a cruel mouth, the dull eyes of a man who had nothing and wanted to own a wife the way he might own a hoe. Instead, she found a calm she did not understand. Warm, dark brown eyes, steady and gentle, set in a strong jaw shadowed with light stubble. He inclined his head to her, a small grave courtesy, the greeting a man gives someone he respects. Not a thing being traded, a person. And the kindness of it, in a face that had no right to be kind, made the laughter harder to bear. "His name is Obinna," her father said, turning to her, lowering his voice as though the lowering could undo what the whole village had just witnessed. "He is a good worker. He came from the next district looking for land to farm. He has offered the goat as the bride price. We will eat tonight, Idese. Do you understand? Tonight we will eat." She understood. That was the cruelty of it. Her mother had been dead 3 years. The harvest had failed 2 years running, the yams rotting black in the ground, the cassava no taller than her hand. Her 2 small brothers, Chuka and Emeka, had stopped asking for meat months ago because they had learned that asking only made their father's shoulders fall. The roof leaked. The debt to the trader Okonkwo had grown teeth, and here, in the yard, stood a goat. A living animal that could be sold, or milked, or bred. To her father, drowning, the goat was a rope thrown from the bank, and she was the price of the rope. "Father," she said quietly, "you are giving me to a stranger for the price of a goat." "I am giving you to a man who will feed you," he said, and his eyes were wet, and that was the worst part, that he believed it. That he had told himself this story so many times it had hardened into mercy. Better a poor man's roof than starving under mine. Across the yard, the loudest voice belonged to Kinyer, the trader Okonkwo's wife, resplendent in a scarlet Ankara wrapper with gold at her ears and gold on her wrists. A woman who had never gone to bed hungry and never let anyone forget it. She pointed one ringed finger across the compound and laughed so that her whole body shook. "One goat," Chinyer called out, her sweetness poisoned at the root. "Idese, my dear, even the goat looks ashamed of the bargain. Tell me, will you sleep in his fine house, or share the straw with his fine livestock?" The women around her tittered, 3 of them at once, lace and wax print bright in the sun, fingers half raised to their mouths, eyes shining with the particular joy of watching someone fall below where they stood. Idese felt the heat climb her neck. She opened her mouth and found nothing in it worth spending. What was there to say? Every cruel word of it was true. But then the stranger spoke. Obinna. His voice was low and even, pitched not for the crowd but for the yard, and still it carried. A quiet thing cutting clean through their noise. "A goat is what I have to give today," he said. His eyes were on Chinyur now, mild and unhurried, without a flicker of shame. "A man gives what he has. I would not insult this family by pretending to more." Chinyur's smile faltered, a flame ducking in a draught, there and gone. She had expected him to cringe. Poor men cringed, that was the order of things. This one did not. "And tomorrow?" She shot back. "What will you have tomorrow, farmhand?" "Tomorrow," Obinna said, and the corner of his mouth lifted, "is not yet here. But I have noticed it always comes." A few of the men under the tree laughed at that, and this time the laughter was not at him. Chinyur heard the difference. She drew her wrapper tighter, lifted her chin and turned away, and Adaise watched the proud woman retreat and felt, for the first time that terrible morning, something flicker in her chest that was not despair. She had no name for it yet, but it was warm, and it had come from the stranger's voice. The bride price was accepted before the sun was high. There was no feast, no dancing, no long days of negotiation between two prosperous families. There was a goat, a handshake, and a girl told to gather what she owned, which fit easily into a single cloth bundle. By the time the shadows began to lean, Adaise was walking out of the only compound she had ever known, behind a man she had met that morning, while the village watched from doorways and pretended not to. "She'll be back in a week," she heard someone murmur. "Starving men make starving husbands." "Poor thing," said another, in the voice that means the opposite of pity. "Sold off at market, traded for an animal." Obinna walked ahead with the goat's rope in one hand and her bundle, which he had quietly taken from her, in the other. He did not look back at the village, did not hurry, did not try to fill the silence with promises he could not keep. When the path narrowed at the edge of the cassava fields, he stopped and waited for her to come level with him, and matched his pace to hers. "You did not have to carry my things," Adaise said. It was the first thing she had said to him directly. "It is a long walk," he answered, "and you have walked a hard road already today, with everyone watching. Let the rest of it be easy." She glanced at him sidelong. He was studying the fields as they passed, the failed crops, the cracked irrigation channels choked with weed, and there was something in his examination that did not fit a farmhand looking for work. Once he stooped without breaking stride, took up a handful of the dead gray soil, crumbled it slowly between his fingers, and let it fall, and his jaw tightened at whatever it told him. A farmhand looked at land and saw a day's labor. This man read it the way a healer reads a sick child, with a quiet, calculating sorrow, already counting what it would take to make it well. "You are not from here," she said. "No, where then?" He was quiet for a few steps. "A place where they also forgot how to share water with the man downstream," he said at last. "Where the strong took the rain and let the weak go dry and called it the will of God. I left it to learn whether the world had any other way of being arranged." He looked at her. "I am still learning." It was a strange answer. It told her nothing, and it told her a great deal. Adaise did not press. She had been given to this man for a goat. She would learn who he was slowly, by living beside him. For now it was enough that he had carried her bundle and stood between her and Chinyur's tongue, and not once looked at her the way the village men looked at women, as though she were fruit on a branch to be reached for. His farm, when they reached it as the light went gold, was modest past the point of poverty. A single room of mud brick with a thatched roof recently and carefully repaired. A lean-to for goats, empty until the thin brown one was tied inside it. A clay stove, a water pot, a narrow bed, a sleeping mat rolled in the corner, a single battered bicycle against the wall, and little else. It was clean. It was bare. It was the home of someone who owned little, but kept that little in good order. Obinna set her bundle inside the door. Then he carried the sleeping mat out of the corner, unrolled it on the floor by the wall, and laid his cheap wristwatch on the windowsill beside it. "The bed is yours," he said. "I will sleep here." Adaize stared at the mat on the floor, and at the man straightening up from it, and did not know what to do with the size of her own confusion. "You bought me," she said. The words came out harder than she meant them. "You gave a goat for me. Everyone in the village knows what that means. I gave a goat to a desperate father so that you and your brothers would eat tonight," Obinna said. He did not raise his voice. He never did. That is what the goat was for. It was not for this. He gestured once at the small distance between the bed and the mat. "I do not own you, Adaize. No man can own a person. Whatever else they say in the village, in this house, that is not how we will live." She sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, because her legs had stopped being sure of themselves. Outside, the last birds were arguing in the dusk. The thin goat bleated in its lean-to. "Then why?" she asked, and her voice cracked on it. "Why would a poor man pay a goat he could ill afford for a wife he does not intend to use? It makes no sense. Nothing about you makes any sense." Obinna crouched by the clay stove and began, methodically, to build a fire, feeding in dry sticks one at a time. And for a while she thought he would not answer at all. "Because I watched your father in the market last week," he said finally, the small flame catching, throwing moving light across the planes of his face. He was trying to sell a basket of half-rotten yams, the last thing he had, and a fat trader's wife was laughing at him for it in front of everyone. He fed the fire another stick. There was a girl with him, carrying water. She did not laugh at her father. She did not look away from him in his shame. She took the worst yam from the basket and ate it herself, so there would be one fewer for them to mock. He looked up at her then, across the small fire. "I have met many people who are kind when it costs them nothing. I had begun to think there was no other kind." His eyes held hers. "And then there was you, swallowing the worst of it so a broken man could keep a scrap of his pride. That is a thing I had stopped believing was real." Adaize said nothing. She had not known anyone had seen. "So when I learned he meant to marry you off to settle his debts," Obinna went on, banking the coals, "I came with the only price he would have respected, because a gift refused is an insult, but a bride price he could not. I gave the goat so that no other man would give worse. That is all." He stood, brushing the dust from his knees. "You owe me nothing. Not the bed, not your gratitude, not even your trust, until I have earned it. Tomorrow I will show you the farm, and we will see what can be grown on it. Tonight, eat and sleep, and let the village say what it likes. The village is very far from this fire." She lay awake a long time that night on the narrow bed, listening to the even breathing of the stranger asleep below her, watching the last red glow of the coals, and trying to make her heart stop doing the foolish, dangerous thing it had begun to do. It was easier to be a girl traded for a goat. A sold girl could keep her heart locked. But a girl whose husband took the floor so that she might have the bed, who had married her over a spoiled yam she ate in a market to spare a father's shame, who spoke of letting the weak drink before the strong as though nothing in the world mattered more. That girl was in far more danger than the village understood. The weeks went by, and they did not break her, and the village could not understand it. Adaize did not come crawling back. The farm did not collapse. Instead, something stranger happened, something the village heard about in fragments and refused, at first, to believe. The thin brown goat grew fat. Then there were two. and then a small herd, because Obina knew things about animals that no ordinary farmhand had any business knowing. The timing of breeding, the signs of sickness caught a week before it showed, the right grasses for milk. The dead field behind the house came back to life under his hands. He dug the choked irrigation channels open and ran water to the dry corners, and where the village had let the high ground take everything and the low ground go thirsty, he built small earth banks so the rain was shared. Cassava rose green and tall. Yams swelled in the mounds. And Obina, the poor farmhand the whole district had watched walk in trailing a single thin goat, began, quietly, to give the surplus away. He gave milk to the widow Neka, whose own children had gone to the city and forgotten her. He gave yam sets to the young couple who had lost their seed to the same blight that ruined Adezi's father. He showed two stubborn old men how to dig their channels the new way, and did not gloat when their crops came up after years of failure. He never asked anything in return, never made a speech of it, and when people thanked him, he looked embarrassed and changed the subject to the weather. "Your husband is a strange man," the widow Neka told Adeyezi one afternoon, the two of them shelling melon seeds in the shade. "A clean spring risen in a thirsty country. You don't trust it at first. You keep waiting for the poison." The old woman cracked a seed with her thumbnail. "There is none in him, child. I have lived long enough to taste the difference. Whatever your father got for that goat, he was robbed." Adeze laughed, surprising herself. She had been laughing more lately. The tired, tear-streaked face that had stood in her father's doorway was filling out, learning to smile without first checking whether smiling was allowed. Her hands had hardened with farm work, but her shoulders had come down from around her ears, and she had stopped flinching at loud voices. She had also, somewhere in those weeks, stopped pretending to herself that she had not fallen in love with her husband. It had happened slowly, channel by channel, root by root, the same patient way the dead field had greened. It had happened the night he sat up till dawn with the sick goat everyone said would die, talking to it low and patient, and in the morning the goat lived. It had happened the day she caught a fever and woke to find he had walked to the next district and back, a whole day on foot because the bicycle's tire had given out, to bring her medicine and a small absurd paper twist of sugar sweets, because, he said gravely, sick people should have something that was only pleasant and good for nothing else. It had happened 100 small times, in 100 small kindnesses no one had paid him to perform. And one evening, watching him mend a neighbor's fence by lamplight without being asked, she stopped fighting it. Still, the question would not leave her. Who was he, truly? Where had a farmhand learned to read a sick animal with a healer's certainty, to bend water across a dead field with an engineer's trained hand, to give as though he had never once in his life feared running out? When the harvest was sold and money came into the house at last, he handled it carefully but without the desperate, clutching attention of a man who has always been poor. He counted it, set aside what they needed, gave a portion away, and buried the rest in a clay pot beneath the floor without ceremony. Money was a tool to him, not a god. "You give too much away," she said, watching him press coins into the hand of a boy sent by the young couple who had lost their seed yams. "We are not so rich that we can feed the whole road. We have enough," Obina said. "When you have always had little, you hoard. When you have learned that more will come, you share. And how would a farmhand learn that more will come?" He smiled, but he did not answer, and he closed the lid of the clay pot, and the smile told her nothing and everything. Poor men did not treat money that way. Having so little, they made it everything. Once she asked him directly, lying beside the low fire, the question she had carried since the first night. By then they shared the bed. The mat had been rolled back into the corner weeks ago, on a night neither of them spoke about afterward, and both of them thought about often. "Obinna," she said into the dark. "Who are you?" His hand found hers. He was quiet so long she thought he had fallen asleep. "I am the man who carried your bundle," he said at last. "I am the man you ate the rotten yam in front of, before you knew anyone was watching. The rest is a story for another day." He turned his head on the pillow toward her. "Is it not enough for now to be happy? The day is coming when you will know everything. I promise you that. But when it comes, Daisy, whatever you learn, I want you to remember the farmhand. Remember the goat and the floor I slept on, and that I came to you with empty hands. That you chose me anyway. One day it will matter more than you can imagine that you opened your heart to a man with nothing in his." She did not understand, but she pressed her face to his shoulder, and she let it be enough. And she did not know that the day he spoke of was already on its way, riding toward them across the dry country, closer with every dawn. Pride, it turned out, could not leave the farm alone. Chinyir came in the dry heat of an afternoon, riding out from the village in a hired cart with two of her glittering friends, on the pretext of buying milk, though everyone understood the true errand. She had heard that the goat bride had not died after all. She had heard the dead field was green. And a woman who has built her whole self on standing above others cannot bear, for long, to be wrong about who is beneath her. So she came to see the poverty with her own eyes, to drink fresh contempt at its source. She found a Daisy in the yard, sun-browned and strong, pouring fresh milk into a clay pot, a fat goat nosing at her wrapper, and the sight plainly displeased her. "So," Chinyir said, climbing down from the cart without greeting, her gold catching the light, her nose wrinkling at the smell of the lean-to. "You are still here. We had a wager in the village, you know. I said 1 month. I lost." "You lost," Daisy agreed mildly, and went on pouring. Chinyir's friends giggled behind their hands. Chinyir strolled a slow circle around the compound, cataloging the poverty aloud. The one room, the thatch, the single battered bicycle against the wall. "How quaint," she said. "How rustic, how very humble." She paused at the lean-to. "And these are the famous goats. I expected more, for a husband who paid a goat for his wife. 1 goat in, a few out. What an empire. Would you like some milk?" Daisy asked. "It is fresh. There is more than enough." The question landed wrong, because it was kind, and kindness has no handle for a person who came to wound. Chinyir's smile thinned. "I did not come to drink a poor woman's milk," she said. "No," Daisy said. "I know why you came." She straightened, the clay pot on her hip, and for the first time she looked the proud woman fully in the eye, with the settled calm of a field after rain. "You came to make sure I am still beneath you. So look, here I am. The milk is good, the field is green, my husband is kind, and I am not coming back to be your entertainment. Drink the milk or do not. But you have seen what you came to see, Chinyir, and it is not what you wanted." For a moment the trader's wife had no words at all. Then Obinna came around the side of the house with a hoe over his shoulder, his plain shirt dark with honest sweat, and Chinyir snatched her composure back up and fixed it over her face. "Ah, the farmhand himself," she said, recovering her cruelty. "Tell me, do you know your wife is too good for milking goats? Or did the goat you traded come with no instructions?" Obinna set the hoe against the wall. He did not rise to it. He went to the pot, poured a cup of the fresh milk, and held it out to her, exactly as his wife had, his warm eyes entirely without offense. "You have come a long way in the heat," he said. "Drink before you go. The road back is dusty." And the simple, unwounded kindness of it offered to a woman who had just insulted them both, was the one thing Kinyer could not bear. She did not take the cup. She gathered her friends with a sharp word, climbed back into her cart, and rode away faster than she had come. And the last thing she saw, looking back, was the goat bride and her farmhand standing together in their green field, untouched, the cup of milk still held out after her in the dust. "She will not forgive that," Obinna said quietly, watching the cart shrink down the road. A cruel person can forgive almost anything sooner than being met with kindness they cannot answer. It shames them worse than a blow. "Then why offer it?" Adise asked. He set the cup down. "Because the milk was good," he said simply, "and she was thirsty whether she would admit it or not. What she does with that is hers, not mine." He picked the hoe back up. "Kindness is not a weapon, Adise. It only feels like one to those who have never carried it." Adise watched the dust settle on the empty road and understood that the proud woman would carry the memory of that refused cup all the way to the feast, and that whatever happened when the new moon came, Kinyer had already chosen, again and again, who she was going to be when it did. The summons came from her father. It arrived by way of a small boy who ran the whole distance from the village and stood panting in the yard, and what he gasped out, between breaths, was that Nemeka had decided, at last, to throw the wedding feast he had been too poor and too ashamed to throw all those months ago. The harvest had been good, the boy said. The whole district had heard of the farmhand who made dead fields live, and people were asking questions. And a father, even a father who had once traded his daughter away, did not like to be the only man in the village who had never feasted his daughter's marriage. "He says come on the day of the new moon," the boy recited. "He says the whole village will be there. He says even Kinyer is coming, and bringing her whole family to see." The boy hesitated, then added, with a child's honesty, "She is telling everyone she is coming to watch the poor man's feast, so that she can laugh at the small chickens and the cheap palm wine." Adese felt the old shame rise in her throat. She knew the feast her father could afford even now, and she knew what Kinyer and her bright, cruel friends would make of it. The pointing, the tittering, the sweet, poisoned remarks dropped just loud enough to carry. She had been free of all that out here on the farm, in the small, clean kingdom of the fire and the field. The thought of walking back into the village to be the entertainment all over again made her hands shake. "We do not have to go," she said to Obinna that night. "Let them feast without us. Let them laugh at an empty chair if they must laugh at something." Obinna was sharpening a hoe blade by lamplight, slow and even, and he did not look up at once. "We will go," he said. "You don't know them. You don't know what they will do. Kinyer will turn it into a circus. My father means well, but he cannot afford the feast such people expect, and they will punish him for it, and me, and you. I have only just stopped hearing their laughter in my sleep, Obinna. Don't take me back into it." He set the hoe down then, and crouched in front of her, and took both her hands in his, and his warm dark eyes held hers with a steadiness that, even now, after all these months, she could not entirely fathom. "Adese," he said, "do you trust me? You know I do. Then trust me in this. Your father wishes to feast his daughter's marriage, and a daughter should let her father have that, even a father who once traded her away, because the failing has cost him more than you know. We will go to the village. And I ask you only one thing." His thumbs moved over the backs of her hands. "Whatever happens at the feast, however it begins, do not be afraid. Stand beside me, hold your head up, and do not be afraid. It is time you stopped being afraid of those people. After that feast, you will never need to fear them again. I give you my word." She searched his face for a long moment. There was something underneath the calm. something she had glimpsed before and never been able to name, a thing held in reserve, vast and patient, an ocean behind a low dune. She had married a mystery and paid for the privilege in livestock, and against every instinct the village had drilled into her, she had come to believe that the mystery loved her and would not lead her into harm. "All right," she whispered. "I am not afraid." It was almost true. By the morning of the new moon, walking back along the path she had walked away on, her bundle now a married woman's proper load of cloth and provisions, it was nearly true, entirely. And the small piece of her that was still afraid, she kept folded up and quiet, because her husband had asked her to, and never once given her cause to regret a single thing she had given him. The village had not changed, but Adese had, and so she saw it differently. Smaller, the compound where she had been sold seemed to have shrunk. The great Udara tree, merely a tree now. The well, merely a well. Her father had done what he could. There were benches set under awnings of woven palm, a few goats turning on spits, pots of jollof and egusi soup, gourds of palm wine, modest, honest, and painfully the feast of a father who has clawed his way back from ruin and still has little to show. Set out bravely for a crowd that would measure it against far richer tables. The crowd came. Of course they came. They came in their best lace and their brightest ankara. The whole village and half the district, drawn by the story of the strange farmhand and the girl traded for a goat, ready to enjoy whatever there was to enjoy, and Chinyir came at the head of them. A queen arriving to inspect the poor. She wore scarlet shot through with gold, more gold at her throat and her ears and her wrists than some families saw in a lifetime, and she swept into the compound with her husband Okonkwo and her glittering, sneering friends arranged around her, a court around its sovereign. Her eyes found Adese across the yard, and Adese watched her take in the simple but decent wrapper, the healthy face, the strong frame, the absence of the broken, returning bride she had come to gloat over, and she watched Chinyir's mouth tighten and then curve into something far more dangerous than a smile. "Adese," Chinyir cried, sweeping forward, her voice climbing to fill the whole compound. "My dear, you are alive. We had all wondered. We thought surely by now you had been worked into your grave or eaten by your husband's fine goats." She laughed, and her friends laughed, bright birds again, fingers rising to their mouths. "And here you are. And here is the famous feast. A whole goat. 2, even. How your husband must have saved." She turned in a slow circle, surveying the modest awnings, the honest pots, performing her contempt for the entire village to see. "Tell me, where is he then, the great farmhand? Where is the man who paid a goat for a wife? Has he come on his fine bicycle? Show us. Bring out your husband, Adese, so the whole village can finally see what a single goat buys." The laughter spread. People who did not even dislike Adese laughed, because that is what laughter does in a crowd, fire running through dry grass, taking everyone. Her father, Naimeka, stood at the edge of it, with his head bowed and his hands working, helpless in his own compound, at the feast he had broken himself to give. And the old shame rose in Adese until it touched her chin. But she did not run. She did not weep. She thought of the sleeping mat unrolled so she could have the bed, and the worst yam taken from her father's basket, and the sugar sweets, and the dead field made green, and her husband crouching before her to ask her to hold her head up. She lifted her chin. She let the laughter break and part around her and stood still in the middle of it. And she turned calmly to the man at her side, and she said, in a voice that carried clear across the suddenly straining ears of the entire compound, "Here he is." Obina stepped forward into the open center of the yard. He had not dressed for them. He wore the same plain off-white shirt, the sleeves rolled, the worn sandals, the cheap watch loose on his wrist. He looked exactly like what they had all been told he was, a poor farmhand bought into the district, a man whose entire worth was one thin goat. And Chinyir, seeing him, threw back her head and laughed loudest of all. "This?" she cried, delighted, pointing. "This is the husband? Look at him. Look at the rags. Adeze, my poor child, he has not even changed his shirt to feast his own marriage. He owns nothing. He is nothing." She spread her ringed hands wide to the crowd, playing to them, gathering their laughter into herself, harvesting it. A goat for a wife, and the goat got the better end of it. Did I not say so? Did I not say so from the first day that a poor man a sound stopped her? It came from the road beyond the compound gate, and at first it was only a low rumble that the laughing crowd ignored. Then it grew, and one by one the laughter died on their lips as they turned toward the gate. Engines. Many engines. Deeper and more powerful than any vehicle the village had ever heard. And then, into the dusty mouth of the compound, gleaming and impossible, swept a long procession of white SUVs polished to a mirror shine, and behind them more, until the narrow village road was lined with them as far as the Udara tree, sunlight blazing off chrome and glass. The doors opened, and men began to step down into the village. Not ordinary men. Chiefs. Adeze knew them the moment she saw them, though she had never in her life stood near such people, because everyone in the land knew the regalia of the great ones. The red Isiagu shirts worked with gold, the heavy coral beads at throat and wrist, the carved staffs of office, the leopard motifs that only the highest blood might wear. Chief after chief. The lords of districts she had only ever heard named in stories, their wives in cloth that cost more than her father's entire compound. And behind them, last of all, an old man so wrapped in coral and authority that the very air around him seemed to bend. A man at whose appearance the few villagers who knew his face fell utterly silent and began, helplessly, to lower themselves toward the ground. The crowd did not understand. Chinyir did not understand. She stood with her ringed hand still half raised, her mouth still half open on her unfinished insult, staring at the river of gold and power flooding into the poor man's feast. And then the chiefs saw Obina. The whole magnificent procession stopped, and as Adeze watched, frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth, the greatest men in the land, men before whom governors bowed, men whose names were spoken with awe from the coast to the far hills, turned toward her husband in his faded shirt and his split sandals, and as one, with a rustle of coral and silk that seemed to suck the breath from the whole compound, they knelt. They went down into the dust, to the farmhand, to the man who had been bought for a goat. The eldest of them, the old man wrapped in authority, lowered himself last and most deeply of all, and pressed his forehead toward the ground and lifted his quavering voice so that it rang across the silent, stunned, kneeling village. "Igwe," the old chief said. The word dropped into the silence and sent its ripples to the farthest wall of the compound. "Your Highness, my prince, we have searched for you across the whole of the land. Your father the king is gravely ill, and the throne waits for you. We beg you, come home." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A goat bleated somewhere, absurdly, into the enormous silence, and not a soul laughed. Adeze turned, very slowly, to the man beside her, to Obina, to her husband, who had slept on a mat on the floor so she could have the bed, who had carried her bundle, who had walked a day on foot to bring her sugar sweets when she was ill. He was looking at her, and only at her. In the middle of all that kneeling gold, and his warm, dark eyes were as gentle as they had been on the first terrible morning in her father's yard. "I told you," he said softly, just to her, beneath the ringing silence, "that the day was coming when you would know everything." A faint, sorrowful smile touched his mouth. "Forgive me, Adeze. I had to know whether anyone in this world could love a man for nothing. I had to know it was real before I could bear to be a prince again." He reached out and took her trembling hand in both of his. "You loved me when I had nothing. Now everything I have is also yours." It was Chinyere who broke first. The proud trader's wife, who had laughed loudest of all, made a small strangled sound and sank to her knees in the dust along with everyone else. But not with the dignity of homage, with the boneless collapse of a woman whose whole world has just been emptied over her head. Her gold meant nothing here. Her scorn meant nothing here. She had spent months sneering at the future king of the land, had called him rags and nothing to his face not minutes ago, while the chiefs of the entire country were riding to kneel at his feet. The understanding of it drained the blood from her face by slow degrees. "Igwe," she stammered, pressing herself lower, her elaborate wrapper trailing in the dirt she had been so careful never to let touch her. "Forgive me. Forgive me, I did not know. I did not know who you were. I swear it on my children. I did not know," Obinna said. He did not say it cruelly. That was the thing Adeze would remember longest, that even now, even with the woman who had tormented his wife groveling in the dust before him, there was no cruelty in him. Only a calm and terrible clarity that was far worse than any anger could have been. "No," he said again. "You did not know who I was. That is precisely the point. Because you believed I was a poor man, you felt free to be cruel. You mocked a man you thought was helpless, and a girl you thought was beneath you, for your own pleasure, because you believed there would never be any cost. That is what you did not understand, Chinyere. The way a person treats the lowly, the powerless, the one they think can never repay them, is exactly who that person is. Not the way you treat me now, on your knees, the way you treated me when you thought I was nothing." He let that fall into the silence and waited while it landed on every listening ear. "My wife took the worst food out of her father's basket and ate it herself in that market," he went on, his voice never rising, "so that her ruined father would have one fewer thing to be shamed for. That is who she is, when she believes no one with power is watching. You laughed at that same starving man, trying to sell his last basket of food. That is who you are, when you believe no one is watching." He shook his head slowly. "I do not need to punish you, Chinyere. You have spent your whole life building a self out of looking down on others. Now the whole village has seen the bottom of it. Live in that. That is punishment enough, and more just than anything I could devise." He turned from her then, dismissing her not with rage, but with a simple withdrawal of his attention, which from a prince was the most complete dismissal of all. And Chinyere remained on her knees in the dust, her gold dull in the sun, abandoned by the very crowd who had laughed along with her an hour before, for they had already, in the swift and shameless way of crowds, gone over to the prince and his wife, and now turned on the trader's wife the same contempt she had spent a lifetime spending on others. There is no lonelier place on earth than the center of a crowd that has decided to despise you, and Chinyere knelt alone in it, and learned, far too late, how cold a thing pride is once the warmth of everyone's deference is stripped away. But Adeze, when she looked at the broken woman in the dust, found that she could not hold the triumph she had every right to hold. She had dreamed, in her worst nights on the farm, of exactly this, of Chinyere humbled, Chinyere silenced, Chinyere made small. And now it was here, and it tasted of almost nothing. She crossed the yard, and she knelt down, not in homage but to come level with the weeping woman, and she did a thing that made the watching chiefs murmur and made her husband's eyes shine. She took Chinyur's trembling, ringed hand in her own work-hardened one, and she helped the proud woman to her feet. "Stand up," Adaise said quietly. "Kneeling in the dirt does not become you. Stand up, Chinyur, and go and find better things to do with your tongue than wound the poor. That is all I ask of you. That is the only price I will ever charge you." She stepped back. "I have been where you are kneeling. I know what it is to be the one everybody is glad to see brought low. I would not wish it, even on you." And the crowd, which a moment before had been ready to tear Chinyur apart, fell silent in a new and shamed and wondering way, because they had just watched the wife of a prince kneel in the dust to lift up the very woman who had despised her. And in that single act Adaise did more to humble Chinyur than all of Obinna's cold clarity, for she made it impossible for anyone, ever again, to mistake which of the two women was truly noble. Her father, Nyameka, had not moved through any of it. He stood where he had stood when his daughter said, "Here he is," at the edge of his own modest feast, while the whole world changed around him. And now it broke over him all at once. He stumbled forward and fell on his knees before Obinna, but his were the tears of a man drowning in something other than fear. "My son," he wept, "my prince, forgive me. I sold her. I sold my own daughter for a goat. I gave the king's son a single goat as though she were he could not finish it." He pressed his forehead to the dust. "I am the most foolish man in the land. I sold a princess for a goat, and never knew the worth of either." Obinna stepped forward and did for his father-in-law what Adaise had done for his enemy. He crouched, and he took the old man by the shoulders, and he raised him up, gently, and looked into his streaming face. "You did not sell her," Obinna said. "Hear me, Nyameka. You did not sell her. You were a desperate man with hungry children, and a failed harvest, and a debt with teeth. And you made the only choice you could see to keep your remaining children alive. That is not the sin you think it is. A man who would let his son starve to keep his pride would be the worst father." He pressed the old man's shoulders. "And I did not come to your market by accident, and I did not offer that goat in ignorance. I had already watched your daughter for a week. I knew exactly what I was buying, and it was not a girl for a goat. It was the chance to be loved by someone who would never know there was anything to gain from loving me. You gave me the one thing in all my father's kingdom that gold could never buy. Do not kneel to me for that. If anything, the debt runs the other way." He helped the weeping man to his feet and embraced him, the prince in his ragged shirt holding the ruined farmer. And the chiefs of the land watched their future king embrace a poor man at a feast of 2 goats and modest jollof, and not one of them thought less of him for it. They thought what the widow Neka had said months before, shelling melon seeds in the shade, that here was a clean spring risen in a thirsty country, and the land would be fortunate to drink from it. Then Obinna turned and held out his hand to Adaise, and drew her to the center of the compound, into the open space where she had been mocked twice now, and would never be mocked again. And he lifted his voice at last, so that it carried to the farthest edge of the kneeling crowd, to the village that had laughed, to the chiefs who had come so far, to all of it. "This is my wife," he said. "She is the daughter of Nyameka of this village. When I came to her, I had nothing in my hands but a goat, and she did not turn from me. When I slept on the floor of a one-room house, she did not despise me. When the whole world told her she had been sold cheap to a worthless man, she chose, every single day, to see worth where the world saw none. She loved me when I had nothing." He looked around the silent compound, at every proud face that had laughed, and his voice rang like struck bronze. Remember this day, all of you. Remember what your eyes were worth this morning, that could look on a prince and call him nothing because his shirt was plain. My wife's eyes were better. May yours grow as wise before life is forced to teach you the way it has taught the woman kneeling in your dust. And the village, ashamed and awed and utterly remade, bowed its head before the truth of it. They did not stay in the village that night, but they did not abandon it either. And that, too, was Obina's doing. Before the procession carried the prince and his bride away toward the palace, Obina stood once more in the center of the compound and made provision, calm and exact, as though he had planned every word of it on the long walk to the feast. The dead fields of the whole district would be made to live as his own had been. The channels opened, the water shared from the high ground to the low, and he would send men who knew the work to teach it freely to any who would learn. The widow Neka, who had called him a clean spring before she knew he was a prince, would want for nothing for the rest of her days. Okonkwo's debt over Nyameka, the debt with teeth that had begun this whole story, the prince paid in full on the spot from a carved box one of the attendants carried. Then he looked at the trader, who had grown fat lending at cruel interest to desperate men, and he did not punish him either, but he said, in front of everyone, "I will be watching how the poor of this district are treated from now on. The throne has a long memory and a longer reach. See that you give me only good things to remember." And Okonkwo, ashen, bowed, and from that day forward was, of necessity, a far gentler creditor than he had ever meant to be. For her father, Obina built a real house, brick and tin roofed, where the leaking mud hut had stood, and saw to it that her small brothers, Chuka and Emeka, would be sent to the finest school in the city, so that no child of that compound would ever again beg the ground for yams. And Nyameka, who had given his daughter away for a single goat and spent every night since hating himself for it, lived out his years in honor as the father of the queen, and learned, slowly, to forgive himself, because his daughter forgave him completely and would not hear another word of it. Only then, with the whole district provided for, did Obina hand his wife up into the white SUV and take his place beside her, and let the great procession bear them home. The palace, when they reached it as dawn broke over the far hills, took a daisy's breath from her body. She had grown up in a one-room house with a leaking roof. She had married into a bare mud hut with a sleeping mat in the corner. And now the gates opened onto a forecourt of pale columns and marble and fountains catching the first gold of the morning. Servants lined the way, and somewhere within, the old king wept with joy to learn his lost son had come home and brought a wife who had loved him. As a pauper, she stood in the middle of it in her simple village wrapper, the same one she had worn to the feast, suddenly afraid in a wholly new way. Obina felt her hand tighten on his. "It is only a house," he said gently. "A large one, with too many rooms, full of people who will fuss over you more than you would like. But it is only a house. The fire we sat by is here. The man who carried your bundle is here. Nothing that mattered has been left behind. I do not know how to be a queen," she whispered. "I know how to milk a goat and mend a roof." "Good," he said. "Those are the things a queen most needs to remember. The rest they will teach you. The milking and the mending you already know, and most of them have forgotten." And it was true. The strangest, most wonderful thing about her husband, Adeze came to understand in the months that followed, as the village girl learned to be a princess, and then, when the old king passed gently in his sleep, a queen, was that the crown changed nothing essential in him. The same calm, the same patient kindness, the same habit of looking at a sick thing, or a poor place, or a frightened person, and quietly setting about making it well. The prince who shared water with the man downstream was the king who built channels across the whole land. And the farmhand who gave milk to a forgotten widow was the king who could not pass suffering without stopping to lift it. And the husband who had slept on the floor so his wife might have the bed was, to the end of his long reign, a man who never once mistook his power for his worth. And Adese, the girl sold for a goat, became a queen the way she had become a wife, slowly, by living it. And she never lost the part of herself that had eaten the rotten yam. On the great feast days she descended the palace staircase in the deep crimson and shimmering gold of a queen, and the whole court caught its breath at the village girl, made magnificent. But she also walked, unannounced, through the markets and the poor quarters in a plain wrapper, learning the names of the women at the wells, finding the children who had stopped asking for meat, and quietly setting things to rights. The court whispered that the queen had never forgotten she was once poor, and they meant it as a small criticism, and she took it, all her life, as the highest praise she would ever be paid. The thin brown goat, the one that had been her bride price, the one the whole village had laughed at, lived to a great and pampered age in the palace grounds, fat and ridiculous and beloved, and Obinna would not hear of it being anything but cherished. That goat, he would say, whenever a courtier dared suggest the animal was beneath the dignity of a royal household, bought me the only thing I ever truly needed. Show it some respect. And the goat, who understood none of this, would bleat at him, low and tired, exactly as it had bleated in the red dust of a poor man's compound on the morning that two lives, and in time a whole kingdom, were quietly remade by a single act of love that asked for nothing in return. So if you are listening to this from a small house with a leaking roof, or from a fine one you climbed to from nothing, hear what the story is telling you, because it is older than the village and truer than the palace. The world will measure you by the shirt on your back and the gold at your throat, and the world will be wrong every time. The chiefs of the land knelt to a man in a plain off-white shirt, and the proudest woman in the village wept in the dust she had refused to touch. And the difference between them was never wealth. It was never wealth. It was only this, that one of them had been kind to the lowly when she believed no one with power was watching, and the other had been cruel. You never know who the poor man at your door truly is. You never know who is watching when you laugh at someone the world has already knocked down. And you never know which small, unwitnessed act of kindness, a rotten yam eaten so a father will not be shamed, a bundle carried so a tired girl can walk easy, is being counted by heaven and stored up against a day you cannot yet see. God exposes the proud and lifts up the humble. The scriptures promised it. A thin brown goat proved it, and Adese lived it from a leaking hut to a marble throne. So be gentle to the one who can do nothing for you. See worth where the world sees rags. Because the day is coming, for all of us, when the procession arrives and the truth kneels down in the dust for everyone to see, and on that day you will be only and exactly what you were when you thought no one was watching. If this story moved your heart, then you are already on Adese's side, and I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, are you Team Adese? Did she do right to lift Chenier out of the dust, or would you have left her there? And wherever in this wide world you are listening from tonight, the great cities or the quiet villages, the coast or the far hills or some other country entirely, comment and tell me where you are watching from, so we can all see how far this little story has traveled. A tale about kindness rewarded belongs to everyone who has ever been counted cheap, and there are more of us, all across this earth, than the proud will ever understand. May the grace that found a girl in a poor man's yard find you, too, wherever you are. And may you never forget the worth of the goat.